we're excited to launch this Future of Leave conversation. As I mentioned earlier, for the folks that were on, we want this to be informal. We want this to be something where it's interactive and chat through something that I think a lot of groups, certainly groups that we've worked with, have struggled with, both tactically, but also strategically. And maybe what we can do just from an agenda perspective is we'll share a little bit about ourselves, Steve and myself, who are hosting, and then we'll jump into really the content of what Lauren has been discovering and the trends that we see in leave. We will have 10 minutes at the end to open it up for Q&A. And again, throughout the conversation, though, feel free to chat, use the chat feature if you have questions that you think resonate with the entire group. We will be sending a recap at the end with the recording of the session. And then, of course, if you have questions specific to leave at that point, feel free to follow up with the folks at Cocoon. So with that, I'll share a little bit about myself. Mark Mangiola. I've been at Sequoia for 17 years. Hard to believe it's been that long. Certainly, leave has been a pain point for many of my clients. So we're excited that there's some bright minds kind of attacking this challenge. So we'll go through some of that technology and the thought behind it. I do want to introduce my co-host, Steve Sullivan, to share a bit about himself.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Great to see everybody. And Lauren, Riley, thanks for putting this together. Just celebrated 10 years at Sequoia, so not quite as long as Mangiola, but really excited about being here. And for us, we just want to bring great access to trending, relevant data and insights in the marketplace. And so what Lauren and the team at Cocoon are doing are just pretty impressive. And so this is a hot topic, and we want to try to help if there's a challenge in your world when it comes to leave. So thanks, Lauren, for helping us lead this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and as we started to prep for this session, a couple things came to mind. One, leave is intensely personal, and for anybody that's on the Zoom that has had a family member that's ill, very challenging time, very difficult to concentrate on work. There's a couple articles actually on the Cocoon website that really struck me. One of them was the GC at Carta, and his story and his journey with a father that was ill. And it really it resonated because, again, I think we all want to work hard for the companies we represent, but life can happen and you need to be able to take time away, and companies that have a very thought out process to help companies with those struggles, it just comes across so well for those employers. I also say that this new world we're living in with a distributed workforce, and then so many DEI initiatives that companies are trying to kind of factor into their strategy, makes the leave conversation even more complex. And so we wanted to talk about those things. And then there's the tactics. I think a lot of times people get caught up with the pain points of leave from an admin perspective. So how do we solve it from a strategic policy landscape perspective and the tactics of getting stuff done in a compliant way? It's pretty complex. So when we heard that Lauren was building this, we were very interested. So with that, I wanted to introduce Lauren, who's the COO and co-founder of Cocoon. Before starting Cocoon, she spent decades in financial services at Stripe and Goldman Sachs. And so with that, I'll pass it to Lauren to kind of walk us through some content around leave and the future of leave. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Mark and Steve, for hosting us. And good morning, everyone. It's so great to meet all of you. I know we've got a pretty intimate group today, and so would love to really encourage everyone to jump in and make this conversational, as Mark mentioned. And just to get everyone kind of get the ice broken a little bit and get the chat going, I figured it could be fun for anyone on the line, if you're open to it, to drop just a note in the chat about where you're dialing in from. So for me, I'm originally from New Jersey, but I'm dialing in from San Francisco, where I've been for the past couple of years, and love it here. It's cold here, as you can tell. I'm wearing a turtleneck. Those of you from East Bay, I see a couple of folks probably much warmer where you are. So as Mark mentioned, my background is in financial services, along with most of our team and my co-founders as well. And really the reason that we started Cocoon was exactly because we saw our own teammates experience leave. where, we would hear these stories about people being wheeled into their C-section and bringing their laptop with them to try and apply for disability insurance, or situations where people were struggling to get their check from their state or from their insurer, and a lot of the challenges that caused when something big was happening in their life, as Mark mentioned, whether it's someone in your family is sick or you yourself are sick. And that was really our goal, is how do we make leave something that can be as easy as hopefully putting out of office in your calendar for both employees and also for HR teams. And so really, I think what we're focused on for today and what we have in mind is around what has changed around leave, especially now that we've had about a year to reflect on the pretty intense period of what's happened with COVID, whether it's mental health, whether it's caring for kids, for older parents. What has changed about leave? And so what we figured would be useful for today is to chat a little bit about what was leave like before COVID, what's changed from both an employee experience perspective, what employees expect when it comes to leave, and also for all of us on the line in terms of the HR teams, what's changed for us on the people side, on the benefits side. And then super importantly is, how should this impact our people strategy? And so we're excited to share a little bit of thoughts there with all of you. And again, would love to keep this conversational. So Mark and Steve will be monitoring the chat and surfacing questions for us to discuss too. All right. And so before diving into what's changed, as a leave nerd myself, what I figured would be actually really interesting is to share a little background on the brief history of leave. And so leave is actually a relatively new concept. It's been around for only about 100 years and started with really World War I, when women first started entering the workforce and realized that, wow, as women are having kids, this is something that is really, really critical in order to get women back into the workforce. And so it was relatively slow progress for quite some time until about 1993, when many of us know the acronym FMLA. Some of us maybe have PTSD from FMLA, but nevertheless, it was a really, really big inflection point in the history of leave when Clinton passed it in 1993, the first time that we have, like job protection at a federal level. And then from there, what we saw was this really interesting kind of inflection around the early 2000s, starting with California. So proud that California was kind of leading the charge here in terms of really rolling out benefits for when it comes to disability, when it comes to paid family leave. And we saw a number of states follow suit after that. And really, it was during COVID that leave became something that was kind of an esoteric thing and elevated to a national conversation where in the fall of 2020, Biden and Harris expressed support for 12 weeks of paid family leave. Now we see that as a big part of the overall kind of federal conversation. And that really speaks to what's changed, which is that this year has been this massive inflection point for both employees and for HR teams when it comes to leave. And on the employee side, what employees have really realized is that what matters to them is not so much, a lot of the stuff that we often like day to day, like snacks or ping pong tables or free lunch, but they've realized that what's mattered to them is when their company steps up in these really critical, but perhaps actually relatively infrequent moments, whether it's a birth, for example, something in your life is challenging, like someone passed away who is very close to you, and so on. And then on the HR team side, there's been this combinatorial explosion of regulations around leave with COVID, and then also new regulations on the horizon from states, and then possibly at a federal level as well. And so a lot of what we're hearing from our partners is that, wow, leave was, already pretty hard before COVID when I had my folks in California and there are some regulations, but now it is literally 10x harder as I have folks across so many different states.
Lauren, do you find that that's what people have anxiety around, is the compliance side of it and maybe don't focus as much on the strategy side of the policies?
Yeah, yeah. I have seen that when people when people leaders come to us, I think one of the biggest anxiety areas is 100% compliance. And part of it is because they're going from this change of being relatively contained to a certain number of states and then moving to say a hybrid model where suddenly you've gone from 2 or 3 states like maybe California, maybe New York to dozens, if not, dozens and dozens of states. And so that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from. And I think, kind of to your point, Mark, because of that, sometimes it can be easy to over focus on that and then also miss the employee experience part of things too. And they're very closely tied because a lot of times the employee experience side relies on, for example, HR teams having knowledge of, wow, like my employee in Massachusetts is going on leave for the first time. How do I guide them through what's available in Massachusetts from a job protection standpoint, what insurance schemes they should be applying for? And oftentimes for HR teams, that's an unknown because it's the first time it's happening. All right. And so why don't we dive into a little bit on what's changed, and figure it'd be good for us to kind of double click on the employee experience side a bit more and dive in deeper there. And Mark had mentioned the story of Mike Wu, who personally for me really, really resonated. And we interviewed him as part of Father's Day. And I think what's been really inspiring about Mike is that he's taken leave, not just as a father, but also as a son. And and also was the original person to design leave, the first parental leave policy at Carta. And I think the way that Mike described it, which is that it may not be intuitive, but it's much more impactful to really be there for these infrequent but life-changing events, is exactly the change that has come into the mindset of employees over this past year, which is that now leave matters for me more than it did ever before. And a lot of this is because employees are struggling in a lot of ways, whether it's mental health, for example, whether it's caretaking. These are all areas that are really, really tough. Recently, we saw a stat from Accenture that surveyed employees back in May, and showing that 1 in 3 employees have thought about quitting during this time period. And this is exactly the problem that all of us on the people side, on the HR side, are trying to solve for, is how do we retain our people, but then also attract people when it comes to these areas that really matter to them. And we're seeing this be reflected in how companies are building their employer brand. And so these are 2 examples of kind of LinkedIn posts that we've seen our partners put out around leave. And the really interesting thing about this is that you notice that it's not so much about the time and the pay. Like, the big header is not so much, 16 weeks of paid family leave or that kind of thing. It's actually much more about the experience, which is, you'll notice that they emphasize a lot about it being an easy and seamless experience, because what's important from employees is really around, as I'm going through this big moment in my life, do I remember this as something where I literally was filing insurance claims as I was being wheeled into my hospital room? Or do I remember this as something where, wow, like my employer sent me this onesie and flowers, and I felt so supported throughout this entire experience? And so in terms of what to really be thinking about when it comes to leave, we figured it'd be useful for us to just start at a baseline level of like, okay, speaking of leave benefits, what are our peers doing in this space? And we ran a survey of venture-backed tech companies in the fall. And really what we're seeing is a couple of things. So first of all, as you can imagine, from the perspective of time and pay, does get more generous over time, from whether you're an early stage company all the way through kind of the, Slacks and Airbnbs and more late stage or public companies of the world. And what's really interesting, though, is that on top of that, you really start to see that over time, there's a lot more of the employee experience side of things layered into just that baseline time and pay. And so this includes, for example, coupling leave with, for instance, mental health benefits like a Modern Health or an employee assistance program. Also, super importantly, flexible return to work is something that we're seeing more and more, and that's a really big trend. So this was actually started or pioneered, I would say, by a couple of companies kind of seeding in the Bay Area. So Dropbox was quite famous for starting their 1 week transition week a few years ago, where employees could return to work and work for 60% time at 100% pay, with the goal that that week was really just focused on catching up on all hands, catching up on email, getting context, settling into your childcare routine, figuring out your pumping schedule, that kind of thing. So those are all really important trends that we're starting to see.
Yeah, and for everybody on the line, we're going to be sending out a recap. I got a couple messages that people taking pictures of this. This is helpful to know kind of what your peers are doing, but we'll be sending a recap with the content, so you can definitely keep this from a benchmarking standpoint.
Love it. Yeah, and please jump in with questions as well. All right. And then in addition to that, really what we're seeing is that companies are layering in about that growth stage, things like a flexible return to work policy. And then once you start to get to that kind of late stage, almost public company stage, that's where you start to see a lot more kind of all of the details around leave. So for instance, a childcare reimbursement, newborn bonus, for instance, maybe a SNU, which I know a lot of people remember. So those are all some of the trends that we're seeing. And the biggest thing is just to look ahead to where you're going to be. So a lot of you on the line are at high growth companies, and today you might be 200 people, but a year from now, you might be 500 people. And so the biggest thing that we encourage folks to do is just to really look ahead, because it does take some time to kind of roll out these policies. And so looking ahead to that next year and what will be expected there is super important. Also, as you're recruiting from companies that are sort of like one step ahead of you, for example.
I was going to ask you, Lauren, do you feel that people in general have a good understanding of what their leave benefits are? Or is it, do people, like when you're talking to companies and you're helping them design their leave programs and manage them, does it seem like employees are there's like a fuzzy area around it? And then do you also, it's like a two-part question. Do you feel like people feel comfortable maxing out their leave benefits, or do they feel, is there like that sense of guilt of like, hey, I'm out that long. Am I able to do that? Is it okay? I don't know if you've seen that stigma change a little bit, or if there ever was one.
Absolutely, on both those areas. So one, I think it is actually pretty fuzzy for people. And part of the reason it's fuzzy in terms of exactly what the leave benefit is because people are afraid to ask. And part of it is like, imagine you're 2 weeks pregnant. You want to understand what's available to you in terms of your time and your pay, and you're kind of browsing around on the wikis, having trouble finding things. You see some 1-800 numbers for various insurance companies, but not really ready to share yet with your HR team and your manager. And so that's where a lot of the fuzziness comes into play, and people are kind of relying a little bit on word of mouth, like, oh, you were a parent, like, what did you get? And so that tends to be what we see. And so I think anything you can do to really help employees be able to access that in private is super, super important. And then I would say that in terms of the using all of the leave, for sure, that's something that we see be challenging, especially for folks in certain roles, like for example, sales roles. So sales roles, we see people like really, really struggle to use their leave. And a big reason for that is that people, like, oftentimes the way that these benefits are designed is that, hey, you get 100% of your base salary during your leave, perhaps, which for a salesperson might only be half your take-home pay. And so that can be a struggle. So we really encourage folks to think very more deeply about how they want to design sort of leave for their salespeople, and we can chat more about what that looks like. But then also, I think, is really kind of encouraging folks, especially dads and non-birthing parents, to take leadership around this. So we've seen, for instance, leadership. I think Mike Wu at Carta is a great example. He took parental leave at Carta twice. And so as a very senior leadership person, seeing someone like that take all their time can be a really important signal to the rest of the company.
Thank you. No, it's super helpful. Yeah, I think that executive kind of role modeling is a big part of this.
The question came up on the Q&A is that benchmarking for US only or international?
It says US only, yeah. Although I would say that a good chunk of the companies who responded had international presence too. Awesome. And we're happy to send out the survey afterwards and share that with everyone too. Okay, great. Awesome. Well, beyond parental leave, we really think of parental leave as kind of the baseline when it comes to leave benefits. And what we're seeing more and more is that companies, especially as you grow and scale, are thinking about a lot of other parts of the employee kind of experience in life and what kinds of leave benefits are super, super important for that. So the three most important ones that we recommend really layering in as you grow are medical leave first. So imagine you have someone who needs mental health leave, or for instance, needs to go in for a surgery. Second area is caregiver leave. So for instance, caring for a child or a parent, for instance. And the third area is bereavement leave. And so those are the top three that we really recommend thinking about and potentially adding into your overall leave benefits, especially medical and caregiver, given that during COVID, this is pretty top of mind for employees from a mental health and from a caregiving perspective. And then over time, as kind of we evolve to the late stage, kind of more public companies, we're seeing things like sabbaticals, for example, or personal leave, even community service leave. And so those are things just to think about in the future on the horizon. Okay. And so really important around this conversation is that it's not just time and pay. And it's really about a lot more than that in terms of the overall employee experience when it comes to leave. And so in terms of some of the trends that we're seeing, and Mark and Steve mentioned this too, there's really three that stand out to us. So first is around DEI. We'll chat more about each of these. Second is about work transitions, just really helping people prepare for leave and return to work. And then the third is really around your talent strategy and a lot of the details around leave there. And so on the DEI front, there's a lot going on here in terms of change. So one of the things that we're seeing increasingly so on the equity front, for example, is really shifting to a world in which there is equal time, equal bonding time, regardless of what kind of parent or caregiver you are. And we're seeing that become more and more prominent. At the same time, what we're seeing is that a lot of companies want to acknowledge that for birthing parents, for example, there is a medical recovery period. And so you can balance that by having equal bonding time. For example, 16 weeks of bonding time for everyone, and also additional time for the medical portion of leave. And so that's one strategy that we've seen become increasingly common versus kind of the traditional of, let's say, like primary parents get 16 weeks and secondary parents get 8 weeks. Also, from a language perspective, we're seeing a big shift away from primary and secondary parent, for example, towards language that's more inclusive. And so the language that we're seeing more and more often is, for example, birthing and non-birthing caregiver or parent. And the reason that's important is because I think a lot of times there's a question of like, what does it mean to be primary versus secondary? But also really importantly is making sure that your language supports anyone who is having a family in any kind of structure. So this could be, for instance, surrogacy, this could be foster care, this could be adoption. So those are all things that we're seeing become more and more prevalent. And then on the work transition front, this is a critical top of mind issue from what we've heard from our partners, which is that even if you have the most generous leave policy, it's about how does your employee, after going on potentially a relatively long leave, like potentially 4 months, maybe even 6 months, get back into the workforce in a way that works for them and has impact for the company. And so this is really important around education. And it's not just employee education around things like, hey, like, how do you have that first conversation with your manager? How do you create your out of office plan, adding your baby to health insurance and so on? But super importantly, what we're seeing is that more and more focus on manager education. And this is really important because especially at high growth companies, a lot of times you have first time managers or frontline managers who haven't really had anyone go on leave before. And what they're craving in terms of advice is, okay, how do I help my employee come back after 4 months? And especially when my team has doubled, which is often the conversation that we have. And so things like, for example, coaching managers around creating a return to work document, or working with their employee to make sure that they update them on things like new projects or new hires on the team, things like offering up during your one-on-one, the expectation setting around new childcare responsibilities or hours. Those are really important. And also super key to this is making it bite-sized, which is that a lot of times what we hear from employees and managers is like, hey, I can't really stomach just a giant checklist of things to do. But what I really want is more like my favorite coaching app, which just kind of gives me almost like push notification style guidance about what to be doing and when throughout this entire experience. And then the third area that's really important that we're seeing is really around talent strategy. And so part of your talent strategy definitely is going to be the overall kind of benefit that you put out there in terms of time and pay, but even more detailed than that and tactical is things like tenure requirements. We often get questions from people leaders around like, hey, like we have a tenure requirement of a year. You have to have been at the company for a year in order to qualify for certain leave benefits, like the paid leave, for example. Is that something that you're seeing? And typically what I share with them is like, it is something that we've seen historically, but we're seeing that go away. And the reason that we're seeing that go away is because the talent market is extremely competitive. And what's really interesting is that by removing that tenure requirement, you can actually see like a pretty meaningful influx of folks, really, really talented people who will actually view that extremely positively, and thinking about starting a family, and maybe have already started on that path and come and join your company. And in fact, I heard one of our one of the heads of people that I talked to explicitly told me that part of her talent strategy was poaching expecting parents, which in some ways is kind of funny, but makes sense because, you know, when you're an expecting parent, so much is changing in your life that you might be like, what the heck, I'll change jobs too. And if your company supports you in that, then amazing. All right, so that was a lot on the employee experience side of things. I think what's also important to Mark's point earlier is that employee experience is super, super key. At the same time, a lot of us on the people side, on the HR side, are being just kind of anxiety induced by all of these regulations that have been on the horizon on a state level, and also just accelerated change because of COVID. And so, you know, as we're looking ahead on the horizon, one of the big areas that's been a topic this year has been Massachusetts paid family leave that rolled out in January. Next year, Connecticut is rolling that out. Oregon as well, Colorado to come. I know we have some Denver folks on the line, so look out for that. But this is really important because it's not just there are more states that are rolling out regulations or insurance schemes around leave, but also our people are just everywhere now. And we thought that Susie, who is the head people at Primer, put it really well when she said, when COVID-19 hit, we became a more geographically distributed company, which meant that we now had to consider the possibility and the risk of our people needing to go on leave in every state and actually in some cases other countries. And so this is something that becomes this almost like the surface area of knowledge for HR teams has just increased, you know, like 20 or 50 fold. And so super, super important on the compliance side of things. And we can chat more about kind of strategies to get ahead of that too. Okay, so I know we're coming up around time in terms of wanting to get into Q&A. So just want to wrap up really quickly with in terms of what does all this mean for our people strategies? So a couple of recommendations here. First is that it's really important to start building your employer brand here. And we've seen companies do this really well through, for example, blog posts, through, for instance, leveraging podcasts, for example, having your people leadership really get out there and shape the brand very intentionally around leave. The second area that's super important is reevaluating your leave benefits. So a lot of you on the line are at companies that are evolving extremely quickly. Also, just given COVID, things are changing, whether it's people being more distributed, for example. Super important to take a look at where you are from a benchmarking perspective and see if that's something that is worth changing. And then if you are going to change that, what we really encourage you to do is to think ahead about a year and design your leave benefits for where you will be a year from now. And then the last part is just really getting ahead of compliance. So making sure that if you do have folks who are moving to different states, for example, making sure that from a leave perspective, you're ready for that, whether it's Massachusetts, for instance, or Colorado in the future. And then the last thing is prepping your recruiting team with talking points. So this is something that we haven't seen as much in the past, but recently has become very, very common in terms of as we're talking to not just kind of HR leaders, but talent leaders, where they're saying, hey, I want to prep my team, my recruiters on the ground with a couple of bullets on this is what, caretaking or parenting or just like how we support our people during these biggest moments of their lives. And so I'll wrap up by just sharing this quote that I really, really love from the former head of people at my former employer, Stripe, which was, these are key points and really are rare experiences, these moments of leave, when you can fall more in love or less in love with your company. And that's really the takeaway here is, how do we make these experiences, whether it's having a baby for the first time, whether it's, going through a family member having some challenges, something where we remember it as being our company really stepped up for us. So I'll turn it back to Mark and Steve to open it up for questions too.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lauren. I think that was super helpful. I know that so many companies have been kind of mired in the admin component of this. I guess one question I had just to start things off is, as you look into 2022 and beyond, like what areas are you seeing evolve? We talked about DEI, but if we're going to kind of have a crystal ball, like what would leave evolve into in the future? I'd love to hear your thoughts there. And then as folks start thinking about some of the things you mentioned earlier, feel free to chime in. We'd love to hear your questions. And if you're shy, you can definitely put it through chat. But yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are as far as evolving leave, what it looks like in 2022 and beyond.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is, when we have conversations with HR leaders, they tell us a lot that leave used to be this area that they're like, I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, where it's so scary. There's so many regulations around it. And as long as you have the, the time and the pay, okay, great. That's good. We're all set. It's working. Let's never touch that again. I think what we're seeing is a huge change towards leave not being so much like a compliance thing, as you were saying, Mark, but really an employee experience thing and a benefit you can actually sell. And that is what we're seeing a lot from our partners, which is like, how do we do marketing around our leave, right? To improve our employer brand there. And then also more holistically, how do we kind of like anticipate the needs of people during leave? And so that's really a big thing, which is a lot of times we hear from, people leaders or benefit leaders that like, oh, people don't actually know about our mental health benefit or different benefits that we've curated for them. And so what's really interesting about leave is that it is actually a massive inflection point in your life. And so we can actually predict as people leaders, what is it that you need during that time, right? And so that's the thing that I see happening in 2022 is using leave as a benefit and also using that inflection point in people's lives to actually really surface all of the other curated benefits that you have and bring that in front of your people.
And with just a secondary question around just the compliance perspective, you mentioned the new distributed workforce, you have all these states that, companies weren't in before. Like, how do you manage like PFL laws and state versus FMLA? It's mind numbing to me, like how these interact with each other. Like, how do you guys view that?
Yeah. So there's really two important things here. So one is just making sure that you get your compliance notices uh, right for each of the different states. So just like you have to provide notice around FMLA in terms of job protection, same thing for any state, for instance. So for instance, CFRA in California as an example. So that's kind of the baseline. But then super importantly, the question that we get a lot from people leaders is like, how do I actually help my employees understand what's available to them? Because you can imagine that, for instance, maybe the 12 weeks that California offers under CFRA in terms of protected time there is actually extends beyond your actual company policy. And is that okay? And it is okay. The main thing is just to be able to help your employees understand that they can, in a way, kind of like toggle on additional leave from their state that's specific to them. But making sure that you communicate it in a way that's very clear in terms of it might be only partially paid, for example, by your state, or maybe it's unpaid. And so those are all things that's super important to keep in mind.
I got a quick question for you. So when you start to engage with kind of new potential clients, is there a theme that you kind of see them all struggle with, or things that they're coming to the table with questions or just insights on what they're doing today? And then what do you see, 6 months, 12 months, or 24 months after they maybe potentially partner with you on what the outcomes are of what they put in place? Is there any like uplift? Is it just, does everyone feel better? Is it like is the strategy just like solid, or kind of the beginning and the end? If you could kind of share that, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, totally, Steve. I think the biggest thing that we hear from our partners is that usually what triggers a conversation is there was a leave that happened and it was a struggle. And so, we would hear from people who went on leave things like, hey, like it was so confusing. There was so much miscommunication. Um, we literally, one parent shared with us, for example, I heard that there's only like choose to eat, sleep, or shower. And instead, I was building spreadsheets showing what I was owed in terms of my pay. And so that's kind of the before. And then what's really important is taking away all of this burden for employees during this, really big transition point in their life, right? Like, for example, applying for STD and then SDI and then PFL and understanding FMLA and CFRA and all these crazy acronyms and paperwork. So our goal is really, how do we take that off your plate so that you can focus on your family and your work? And the kind of after of that is really that people were like, there was a process. I didn't even know there was a process. And I think the big contrast is between people who, for instance, experience leave, say with Cocoon, and then their partner is kind of there struggling with all of the claims. And so we heard one parent, for example, at Carta share like, this was, I didn't even know there was a process around leave. And then I saw what my wife had to go through. And I was like, wow, I wish that she had Cocoon. And so that's kind of what we're seeing in terms of the conversation starter really being, our employees are really having a rough time with this. How do we make this something that coming out of it, they remember about our onesie as opposed to building spreadsheets about their pay?
Yeah, and what do you see as, and that's super helpful, thank you. What are folks usually doing today? Is it just being managed internally in-house most of the time? People are just trying to figure it out on their own? Or what does the landscape look like? Because it's probably a couple different ways to really manage this, right?
Yeah, for sure. It actually really differs depending on the size of the company too. So what we're seeing is that for companies that are probably maybe like anywhere from, say, like early stage, like maybe you only have even 30, 50 people, all the way through companies that are a few hundred, maybe even up to kind of low thousands. A lot of times leave tends to be managed by the total rewards team or the benefits team. And maybe there's someone who has a pretty good lens on a certain state, like California, for example. And so oftentimes it's a lot of meeting one-on-one with employees. And we've heard stories about people teams literally screen sharing with people to help them fill out their claims, like really hands-on, building custom spreadsheets for their pay and so on. So that's typically how we see it to start. And then over time, and really like the big challenge there is just scaling, because it might work at a certain stage where maybe you only have 100 people and one leave every 6 months, but at a certain stage, then it becomes something that becomes very, very challenging from a just sheer volume perspective. But then I would say that as you get to more companies that are in the thousands and thousands of employees, that's where you see companies are typically already have kind of engaged someone like a Matrix or a Sedgwick or a Reed Group, or maybe through their insurer, for example. And so a lot of times the reason for that is just for pure compliance reasons, which is like on a baseline perspective, we just need compliance coverage so that we are protected as an employer. But what's really missing there is the employee experience.
Yeah, and with just a couple of minutes left, definitely want to encourage anybody that has a question to ask away. But it just seems like it's been disjointed. I mean, that's the past where, like you mentioned, like you're reaching out to the insurance carrier and then your employer is trying to help as well. But the other theme that I've seen is that certainly technology can help us, but how do we help companies get the executives in the room? Have you seen any tricks where, you mentioned the GC at Carta, obviously had executive support to their leave policy. How do you engage the executives who I think will care about retaining their employees, certainly, but is there a trick you've seen where we get that buy-in from the top down to create a policy first that will make sense and then obviously administer it professionally? How do you engage the C-level folks?
Yeah. I think the C-level, the people leadership, the C-suite are very, very engaged by employer brand. And so to the extent that, for example, what we've seen really resonate is like, how do we do co-marketing together to build your employer brand around how you're supporting people through parenting, through caretaking, through mental health, and so on? That is probably the most critical thing that resonates. The other kind of trick that we've seen is that a lot of times companies will have parent or caretaker kind of like ERGs or like Slack channels. And so to the extent that you can get one of your executives to be the executive sponsor for that group. So like Mike, for example, at Carta is very, very active in the parent Slack channel there. So that's a great way just to get executives engaged, but also kind of to showcase like this is something that we really care about.
Got it. Well, cool. We are at the quarter hour. I want to thank everybody that's joined us this morning. I certainly learned a good amount here. Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate your time. Just some housekeeping. We are going to send, the Cocoon folks are going to send a recap with everything we've discussed. If you're interested to learn more about the Cocoon and how it works, feel free to reach out to them directly. But again, appreciate everyone jumping on. Thank you to the team at Cocoon for really providing us such insightful comments. And we're going to continue this on. We'll see other trends and continue these coffee sessions. But again, thank you for joining. I know everyone's going to be jumping off now, but really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your week, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mark and Steve. Really appreciate you hosting.
Thanks, Lauren.